Chapter 1. New Beginnings in West Egg.
In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me advice that has lingered in my mind ever since. Try to remember that not everyone has had the advantages you've had. This counsel shaped my tendency to hold back judgment, a trait that prompted many a confidant to reveal his or her hidden miseries in my presence, sometimes, frankly, more than I wanted to know. After the Great War, restless in the Midwest, I decided in the spring of 1922 to head east and learn the bond business. My family agreed to help finance me for a year, and so I found myself in a little bungalow in West Egg, a place that felt half frontier outpost, half extravagant stage. West Egg was the domain of new money, with lavish displays of wealth that tried, perhaps too earnestly, to prove themselves. Across the bay lay East Egg, where old money glittered in majestic mansions. My own house leaned in the shadow of a colossal mansion owned by a man named Gatsby. At the time, that name was simply an echo in my neighborhood, a figure glimpsed from afar, larger than life. One evening, my second cousin Daisy and her husband, Tom Buchanan, whom I'd known at Yale, invited me to dinner at their palatial East Egg estate. I stepped into a house permeated with warm breezes that set the curtains billowing like pale ghosts. Tom, sturdy and domineering, greeted me with a kind of aggressive hospitality, while Daisy, lovely, bright-eyed, and sad, seemed a different person each time she spoke. She introduced me to her friend Jordan Baker, a wiry, self-assured golfer who lounged as though any chair was a throne meant just for her. At one point, Daisy mentioned her little daughter with an offhand wistfulness.
"I'm glad it's a girl."
She confided to me, turning her face so the wind caught her hair.
"And I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world. A beautiful little fool."
Her words struck me, part cynicism, part plea for the child's innocence, in a world where illusions seemed safer than reality. Our dinner was suddenly disturbed by a phone call clearly meant for Tom. The atmosphere turned electric. I gleaned, though no one openly said so, that Tom had a mistress in New York. Daisy's voice caught for a moment, then floated back into polite gaiety, as if nothing in the world was amiss. When I returned home, unsettled, I noticed a solitary figure on the lawn next door. He stretched his arms toward a tiny green light across the water. Before I could call out, he vanished, leaving me alone with the faint sound of waves and the sense that there was something urgent, almost devout, in that gesture.
Chapter 2. The Valley of Ashes and Tom's Secret Life.
Not long after, Tom insisted I join him on a trip into New York. Partway along, we disembarked at a bleak stop in a strange, gray corridor called the Valley of Ashes, where the ashes coated every surface like a dead snowfall. Over it all loomed a gigantic, brooding billboard with wide blue eyes peering through yellow spectacles. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. Something in those eyes unnerved me, as though they witnessed every folly and sin drifting beneath them. Tom led me to a dingy garage run by a spiritless man named George Wilson. Wilson's wife, Myrtle, emerged from behind dusty curtains, full of coarse vitality in contrast to her meek husband. At Tom's abrupt signal, Myrtle joined him, leaving George to blink after us in confusion. I realized now the mistress Daisy had hinted at was this woman. In Manhattan, Tom took Myrtle and me to a small apartment he kept for their liaisons. Myrtle discarded her drab outfit for a dress that seemed to inflate her sense of importance. Soon, her sister Catherine and the McKees, a couple from downstairs, arrived. While whiskey bottles drained, Myrtle chattered about money and gazed at Tom with a proprietorial gleam. The discussion turned to gossip. Someone mentioned a fellow named Gatsby out in West Egg, rumored to be a nephew of Kaiser Wilhelm, or perhaps a spy. The notion made me think of the distant figure reaching toward the green light. Tension soured the evening when Myrtle repeatedly taunted Tom by saying Daisy's name. A hush fell, broken by Tom striking Myrtle with shocking force, breaking her nose. In the confusion, bloody towels, shouts, tears, I slipped out, rattled by how swiftly shallow merriment had collapsed into raw violence. The night ended with me alone, waiting for a train, feeling both repelled and grimly fascinated by the careless brutality I had just witnessed.
Chapter 3. Gatsby's Dazzling Fate.
My introduction to Gatsby himself came via one of his renowned weekend parties. Every Friday, crates of fresh oranges and lemons arrived at his mansion, and every Saturday, a small army of caterers and an orchestra transformed the grounds into a festival of color and music. I watched from my porch as cars glided up, guests laughing and swirling through the gates. Invitations were rarely issued. People simply came. Yet a chauffeur delivered a printed card inviting me personally. Entering Gatsby's glittering gardens, I found myself adrift among strangers. The air was thick with laughter, jazz rhythms, and champagne fumes. Lanterns cast shifting patterns on the lawn. In the swirl, I spotted Jordan Baker, sitting elegantly as though the party were a stage set made for her. We strolled together, hearing more rumors about our host. Some whispered he'd killed a man, others insisted he'd spied for Germany. I found a quiet moment at a table, chatting with a man about our shared experiences in the war. He had a warm smile, one of those that make you feel wholly understood for an instant. Only then did he reveal himself to be Jay Gatsby. Before I could ask him much, he was summoned away.
"Excuse me, old sport,"
he said politely. I noticed he used that phrase, old sport, with a formality that set him slightly apart from the boisterous crowd. Jordan was called into a private conversation with him. It seemed there was more behind Gatsby's social world than met the eye. Later, as the revelers departed or passed out, I glimpsed Gatsby watching the moonlit water. He seemed oblivious to the stragglers weaving about his manicured grounds. His gaze was fixed toward East Egg. I couldn't help recalling his outstretched arms toward that green light, half admiring, half sorrowful.
Chapter 4. Gatsby's Story and a Favor for Love.
In the weeks that followed, I saw Gatsby more frequently. He took me to the city in his lemon-yellow car and, in an almost rehearsed tone, recounted his past. The son of a wealthy Midwestern family, educated at Oxford, a decorated war hero. It sounded grand but left me uneasy, like he was reading from a script. He introduced me to Meyer Wolfsheim, an older man rumored to have underworld connections, famous for having fixed the World Series years ago. I began to suspect that behind Gatsby's sparkling persona lay a labyrinth of questionable dealings. That afternoon, Jordan Baker filled me in on Gatsby's true motive. Long ago, before the war, Daisy had been Gatsby's beloved. He was just an obscure young officer then, but Daisy, dazzling and protected by her family's wealth, captivated him utterly. They might have married had he not gone overseas, leaving Daisy to waver in his absence. Eventually, she married Tom Buchanan in a lavish ceremony. Gatsby, however, never let the dream die. He returned, made a fortune somehow, and bought the mansion across the bay, hosting parties on the off chance Daisy might appear. But his hope had remained unfulfilled, and now he wanted my help. He asked if I'd invite Daisy over for tea, where he could accidentally encounter her after 5 years of separation. I felt a tug of sympathy for his longing, yet it filled me with foreboding. Tom was formidable, and Daisy's life was complicated. Still, the romantic aspect of his request stirred me. I agreed to play my small part.
Chapter 5. A Rainy Reunion, a House of Dreams.
I arranged Daisy's visit on a drizzly afternoon. Gatsby arrived absurdly early, looking like a boy forced to wait outside the principal's office. He set my cottage ablaze with flowers, then stood fretting over every detail. When Daisy finally arrived, blissfully unaware, she was startled to find Gatsby in my sitting room. The tension was excruciating. Gatsby nearly toppled an old clock, stammered a greeting, and called me old sport with forced cheer. Daisy's hands trembled in her lap. Slowly, they softened to each other's presence, as if the rain outside had gently washed away the years. Their voices lightened to shy laughter. Once the clouds broke, Gatsby insisted we cross to his mansion. There, in room after sumptuous room, I saw Daisy's eyes widen with wonder or perhaps confusion. In Gatsby's bedroom, he displayed a trove of fine, colorful shirts imported from England. He flung them carelessly, burying Daisy in a rainbow of silks. She sobbed softly, whispering that they were beautiful. It felt as though she understood in that moment the depth of his devotion and the painful extravagance of his dream. I slipped away, leaving them by a window from which one could see, across the bay, the faint green glow. I realized that for Gatsby, that light had symbolized Daisy herself, now standing by his side in all her fragile reality.
Chapter 6. Old Money Verses, New, Owl Eyes, and Gatsby's Longing.
In the aftermath of that reunion, Gatsby's name drew reporters and gossip mongers. Rumors swelled that he might once have been James Gats, a farm boy from North Dakota who had reinvented himself with an almost theatrical intensity. Gatsby, seemingly emboldened by Daisy's reappearance in his life, invited her and Tom to one of his large parties. Tom arrived with a mocking air. Daisy seemed at first entranced by the music and the carnival-like chatter. Yet by the evening's end, she looked pale and uneasy. The frenetic pulse of West Egg's new money crowd didn't match the refined, inherited elegance of her own circle. Wandering inside, I paused in Gatsby's immense library, where I found the eccentric Owl Eyes drunkenly marveling that the books on the shelves were real, not mere props.
"He's a regular Belasco,"
Owl Eyes cried, as if Gatsby's life were an elaborate stage set. Seeing the flicker of doubt in Daisy's eyes that night, I wondered if she too felt the orchestrated nature of it all. After the guests trickled away, Gatsby confided to me that Daisy had not enjoyed the party, that she felt out of place. Desperate, he insisted she declare she never loved Tom, so they could recapture the bliss of their first love in Louisville.
"Can't repeat the past?" he exclaimed, almost offended when I voiced skepticism. "Why, of course you can, old sport."
His unwavering faith both moved and alarmed me. I sensed he was reaching for a dream beyond anyone's capacity to sustain. Meanwhile, Jordan and I grew closer. I found her detachment oddly compelling, her languid posture, the faint tilt of scorn in her voice. Part of me hovered on the edge of something with her, though a dim intuition warned me that she was too much a part of this glittering, careless world I was only beginning to understand.
Chapter 7. A Sweltering Day and the Plaza Confrontation.
As July blazed on, Gatsby shut down his parties. He wanted Daisy's company without the intrusion of strangers. One blistering day, I visited the Buchanan's house, finding Gatsby and Jordan there as well. The air was thick with heat and unspoken tensions. Tom eyed Gatsby with open suspicion, while Daisy sought refuge in small talk. We decided, ill-advisedly, to drive into New York to escape the heat. At the Plaza Hotel, we took a suite that felt stifling, even with the fans running. Tempers frayed. Tom cornered Gatsby about his background, ridiculing his use of old sport and throwing out accusations of bootlegging. Gatsby, trembling with pent-up desperation, pushed Daisy to tell Tom she never loved him.
Daisy began to comply. I never loved him, but her voice faltered.
She admitted there had been moments of love, times she cared for Tom.
Gatsby's face fell. the temperature seemed to climb, and we all glistened with sweat and hurt. Feeling victorious, Tom prodded Daisy to return with Gatsby in his yellow car, effectively showing he had nothing to fear. Jordan and I exchanged a helpless glance. As we followed in Tom's car, we passed the Valley of Ashes, the sun sinking low behind those faded eyes of Dr. Eckelberg, which watched impassively over the dusty ruin. A shriek erupted on the roadway. Myrtle Wilson had dashed out, apparently recognizing the yellow car from earlier. Daisy, in her panic at the wheel, struck Myrtle, killing her instantly and sped off. George Wilson, half crazed, was left with the broken body of his wife. Tom, arriving later, soothed Wilson and implied that Gatsby was the culprit, never mind who had actually driven the car.
Chapter 8. A Vigil by Night and a Tragedy by Day.
That night, too shaken to sleep, I walked to Gatsby's mansion at dawn. I found him still waiting on Daisy's lawn hours after the accident, convinced she might signal him somehow. We retreated to his place, and he recounted in raw detail how he had first come to love Daisy in Louisville. Her voice, her house filled with warmth, the promise of belonging to her world. He had been too poor then, but he was sure he could rise to her level. He clung to the hope that she would call, that all might still be made right. Meanwhile, George Wilson, ravaged by grief, had pieced together that the yellow car belonged to Gatsby. Those looming eyes of Dr. Eckelberg seemed to him like the eyes of God, condemning Myrtle's killer. In a blind rage, he found his way to Gatsby's estate. Gatsby, worn and heartsick, decided to take a swim in his pool, longing for one last taste of summer. I was on my way out when I heard shots rip across the stillness. George Wilson had shot Gatsby, then turned the gun on himself. It was as though an otherworldly hush blanketed the entire scene. I found Gatsby's body floating in the pool's red-stained water. The dream he had so fiercely pursued ended in that silent instant.
Chapter 9. Funeral, Farewell, and the Green Light.
Over the next few days I struggled to arrange Gatsby's funeral, appalled at how quickly the world abandoned him. Tom and Daisy slipped away without leaving a forwarding address. Party guests were nowhere to be found. Even Meyer Wolfsheim declined involvement, citing the need to avoid scandal. Only a handful of people attended, a few servants, Owl Eyes, and Gatsby's elderly father, who arrived from the Midwest gazing in awe at the mansion his son had built. Mr. Gatz showed me a battered schedule from Gatsby's boyhood filled with grand goals, resolutions about reading, exercise, study, like seeds of the man he would become. My own final disillusionment settled in. I ended my fragile courtship with Jordan Baker. She shrugged it off with an air of faint contempt. Tom Buchanan later admitted to me he had told George Wilson about Gatsby, convinced or pretending to be convinced that Gatsby deserved it. Tom and Daisy, I realized, were careless people who smashed up lives and retreated behind their money, leaving others to clean up the wreckage. Disgusted, I decided to return home to the Midwest. On my last night, I wandered across the deserted lawn of Gatsby's mansion, remembering the swirl of music and laughter that once filled it. I thought of Gatsby standing at the shore, arms outstretched toward that faint green light on Daisy's dock. He had pinned all his hopes on recapturing a moment, a golden vision of life with Daisy that turned to dust the moment reality intruded. In that final reflection, I felt I understood him. We humans chase our dreams with an almost mystical fervor, believing we can somehow row against the current of time. But, as I concluded, we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. In Gatsby's unshakable hope lay a tragic beauty, one the world would barely pause to remember, but that I, for one, could never forget. Thus ends my recollection of Gatsby's story. Even now I see him in my mind, shirt sleeves rolled up, eyes shining, believing the future could be seized and the past erased, if only he held on tightly enough to love and ambition. If he was deluded, he was also possessed of a rare faith, and though everything he built was founded on illusions, he left behind the echo of that green light across the water, a reminder that sometimes our most luminous dreams are the hardest to let go.